Well, I've been telling you the last couple times that all these things I've been sharing with you over the last many weeks have been kind of preparatory, trying to get you ready for something that might be a little more powerful, a little more impactful. And we've talked about your parts, and we've talked about conscious awareness, and several other different things along the way, and that'll continue. But I think today I'm ready to sit. I started this once to tell you about how a kid from the south side of Chicago got to be a Buddha. When I was born in 1942, most people in the United States didn't even want to acknowledge that there was such a thing as a Buddha. We were so up to our ass in Christianity and Judaism, and they didn't want you hearing any of this Buddha stuff because Buddha was an unbelievably brilliant being. And most of the things he shared with the world continue to resonate. That's what a great master teacher does. So I mentioned to you that my life changed abruptly when I died as an infant. I don't know how old I was. I just know I was at that age when an aggressive young child tries to get out of his crib. And the incident occurred when I was able to launch myself out of the crib in such a fluid motion, it was unbelievable. I still remember myself getting out after struggling. I timed it perfectly, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, rocking and swaying and kicking, and finally I said, let's do it. And I kicked, and holy Christ, I scaled it. And I remember floating through the air and saying, wow, check this out. And then I hit the floor, and my heart stopped. And I came out of my body. My Aunt Violet was home caring for us. I must have hit really loud because she came running. I could hear her, Bobby, Bobby. And as she came into the bedroom, she saw me on the floor. She reached down and scooped me up with a great deal of violence. I mean, just yanked me. And when my back was thrown back, my heart started. That's the way it is with little kids. They're pretty resilient. All those parts are strong. It doesn't take much to get them going again. But the moment is captured forever in my consciousness. And because I was a child, you move in and out of that. You're still a little kid. And I went through all the things that all other little kids do, except I had a different awareness, a different understanding, even though I didn't know what the hell that meant then because I was still a little kid. When awareness comes to you, you don't always know what it means. You just understand that it's there. So I told you we were Catholics, my family. And if you're a Catholic kid, you got crucifixes all around the house. And unlike Protestant faiths, where they just show a cross in most of their churches, I don't know, maybe some Protestant churches have crucifixes, but in Catholicism, and I believe also in the Orthodox faiths, that cross has the body of the Christ hanging from it, and the better job that's done on it, the more he's hanging. So in our church, and I intend to find out who the artist was that created that statuary, the Christ was fully hanging. His arms, his hands were nailed to the cross, his feet were nailed, and the body was projected forward. So it wasn't like it was mushed against cheap crucifixes. It's just kind of all molded stuff. This was a genuine piece of gorgeous statuary. The first time I saw that, I don't know how old I was, but like I say, the damn things were around all the time. I remember asking, I believe it was my grandmother, because she was seen as the source of wisdom in our house. My parents were divorced, and my mom was kind of a flake, nice lady, but a flake. And trying to figure out what she was, single mom in a time when single moms weren't real popular. There were a lot of widow moms, just right after World War II, And I asked Grandma what the story was on Jesus being nailed to the cross. And Grandma said Well, that's where they crucified him. That's where he died for our sins. Damn. I was 5 and that just sounded like bullshit. It just didn't make sense. How could a son of God have to die for our sins? What kind of sins could a human being commit or perform that would require the death of a son of God? And that was always in the back of my mind. And I remembered listening to the liturgy about how Catholics present the death. And I think this is kind of shared by Catholics and Protestants alike. This notion that the Christ was crucified, and then they took him and they put him in a cave, and there was this immovable stone, but somehow they managed to move it. And then 3 days later, he arose, came out, they again moved the rock, and he had his last few minutes with the faithful, which was a really small group, guys. We're not talking legions. These people, these Christians were being persecuted by the powers that be. So if you were one of the handful of people who saw the Christ when he emerged from the tomb, you were in awe, because people who died just didn't do that. They just didn't come up. And since then, since that incident in front of just a handful of people, the churches, all of them collectively, have built this whole deal about he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. Nana. The whole Christian liturgy about the death and the resurrection of the Christ. So I started to tell you about my church, St. John of God. I mentioned it was a big church, at least in my eyes. I drive around, you just don't see churches as big as St. John of God's was. It had 3 entrances, and I mentioned to you that the center entrance, as you came into the church, the choir stall was above the center entrance, and there was about an 8-foot, might have been a 6-foot, I'm a little kid, remember? I'm 10 years old when this happens. Between the choir stall and the top of the door. And one day at Mass, my consciousness is sucked out of my body and slammed up against that space below the choir stall and above the door, my hands outstretched like I'm being crucified, and light is passing back and forth between me and this crucifix, this magnificent statuary that was in the front of our church. How do you describe that? What the hell is that? So this happened 7 Sundays in a row. The first 2 Sundays, I have no recollection of, just light passing back and forth. Now understand,